Hey everybody, welcome back to another one. This time we're going to be talking about World War II. The last two lectures, we were looking at the interwar years in the United States and Europe and how things were kind of getting funky and causing anxiety, and you have new art and music, psychology, all that sort of stuff. Then we were looking at sort of Asia, Africa, Latin America, their response to the same phenomenon, but also being under colonial rule, what that looked like, how that sort of played out. Well, where all of those things were headed, essentially, although people didn't know at the time, was World War II. So we're going to look at the conflict in a sort of global perspective. My guess is a lot of you have heard about this before, but maybe from a mostly US perspective. So, during the late 30s, the first half of the 1940s, the world is again going to become involved in a global total war, similar to World War I in a sense, in that it's a lot of the fighting's in Europe, but pretty different in a number of ways. The sort of alliances are very different. People tend to sort of glaze over the differences in some contexts. Also, Japan is going to have a much larger role, etc. So let's take a look at it. First, we'll look at the end of peace. Remember, at the end of World War I, there was supposed to be a peace put in place that was going to last forever. You had the League of Nations, all that stuff. So what happens? Then we're going to look at the sort of destructiveness of World War II. It's by far more destructive than any other war in human history. Then we're going to look at wartime life and how, for regular people, life changed in a number of ways. There's a sort of propaganda at play as well, in sort of changes that are made in the mind rather than just changes that are made in the physical environment around people. So, what happened in the 1930s that's going to lead towards World War II? We already sort of saw the coming of the Depression and people experimenting in different ways to try and get their countries out of the Depression or to sort of change their situation. But in the 1930s, those aren't going to all work. There's a lot of sort of growing tension, growing nationalist movements, and a lot of the sort of things that were left unfinished in World War I are going to come back to haunt people around the world. So, for example, we might look at Japan and its interactions with China. So remember, Japan wanted racial equality at the end of the Treaty of Versailles, at the end of World War I. They were denied that. In essence, they're going to sort of reject the League of Nations. Beginning in 1910, as we've already talked about, they colonized Korea, but they realized that in order to continue to grow, to continue to expand, they're going to have to keep going. So they have their eyes set on this large chunk of territory north of Korea that's called Manchuria. And in the 1930s, as the Depression is setting in, Japan is going to start to sort of squeeze its colonies. They're squeezing Taiwan, they're squeezing Korea, because the goal is you want to get all the resources out of the colony into the home country when the Depression is on. So there's a Japanese army that's stationed in this area north of Korea, and they have a great idea. They're going to win a sort of military victory, and then the state will recognize it and they'll get this new territory up above North Korea. So one night, there's a train that runs through this territory and there's an explosion on the track. To deal with it, the Japanese military that's there declares martial law and they enforce the peace. The only problem is they claim it was terrorists, but in fact, they were the ones that had blown up the rail line themselves. So why do they do that? This sort of thing is called a false flag operation. They blow up the rail. There was all this news coverage about terrorists and how dangerous this area was. And the Japanese army said, no problem. We'll take it over. We'll pacify it. We'll make sure everything's working nice and even. And this led to the creation of a new state called Manchukuo. It was allegedly its own independent nation state, but really it was run by Japan. And the whole idea behind it was very much like a colony, was to extract resources and get those back to Japan to help deal with the Depression. When Japan does this, the League of Nations says, whoa, wait a minute, this isn't good. They send investigators, they try to figure out what's going on. But this really upsets the Japanese because they say, look, man, the US, Britain, France, you guys all have colonies. You guys all took over land that didn't belong to you. Now you're coming and you're saying what we're doing is horrible. Why is it bad for us, but it's okay for you? They saw this as really hypocritical. So they're going to leave the League of Nations, just claiming it's unfair and unjust to them. And they're pretty correct. I mean, a lot had changed, obviously, since the end of World War One, but there was definitely a double standard taking place. But over the next couple of years, this isn't going to be enough for Japan. It's going to lead to a full-scale invasion of China. So over the next few years, Japan is going to invade northern China, starting near what today is Beijing, but all the main cities on the coast, Shanghai, Nanjing, these areas that are on like the east coast of China. So Japan is kind of getting geared up for the war in the 30s. A lot of people in America think of the war as like US versus Nazis. But in the sort of global sense, China is where the war starts, with Japanese interaction in China. Another early side of the war that often gets ignored is Italy's attack on Ethiopia. So again, if you're thinking of the war as just like Americans versus Nazis, you're missing a lot of the picture. Remember, Italy was experimenting with fascism. Mussolini was promising to make Italy great again. And part of that story was returning Italy to its like former glorious empire, right? When it was Rome and it ruled the known world. In order to do this, the sort of easiest target for Mussolini in a sense, and psychologically for the people, was Ethiopia. Remember they had tried to attack Ethiopia earlier during the scramble for Africa and it hadn't worked. So Mussolini promises to go back to Ethiopia and to really stick it to those black folks who had beat them before and really embarrassed them in the eyes of other Europeans. So in 1935, Italy begins what comes to be called the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. So the problem with this was it violated the League of Nations Charter. Italy was a League of Nations members, and so was Ethiopia. Theoretically, they were supposed to resolve their differences around a table with pens and diplomacy, not through military action. So it seemed to violate the whole spirit of the League of Nations. Moreover, Ethiopia asked for help from the rest of the League, from Britain, in particular Germany, and nobody would really help them. Germany and Britain both gave them some weapons earlier on, but in this case, they're both kind of out of the picture. Italy also was going to take the opportunity to really demonstrate where fascism can go in terms of the brutality of it. Even though the League of Nations and the Geneva Convention had clearly laid out what was sort of acceptable in war amongst civilized countries, Italy is going to violate those. They begin to use poisonous gas. They begin to use dum-dum bullets. These had been explicitly outlawed under the League of Nations Charter. Dum-dum bullets are kind of like, well, they have the same effect as like a holotip. Basically, a regular bullet has like the case and then it's like round at the end, right? Sort of. But a dum-dum is basically if you just put the bullet in backwards. So the end of the bullet is just like a flat surface. It means they're not as accurate, they can't go as far, but if they hit something, there's a really big sort of broad side of the bullet that hits something. It'll cause a lot of internal damage as it sort of spirals through a person. It makes it very difficult to treat someone for gunshot wounds. It's sort of more lethal, but in a particularly nasty way, in that it's designed to really wound somebody a lot more, cause a lot more internal bleeding and stuff like that. So these had been outlawed, but Italy didn't really care. There was a brand new emperor in Italy, Haile Selassie. You might have heard of him before. This was when he was sort of young and very sort of headed towards trying to be kind of a modern European monarch. This is going to change a lot. He's going to become more of like a symbol of Africa in the future. Rastafarians, if you've ever heard of them, see Haile Selassie as one representation of God. Haile Selassie's birth name was Ras Tafari, so that's where that comes from. Anyway, Haile Selassie flees the country when it's clear that Italy is going to win and forms a government in exile out of London. But before he does that, he stops off at the League of Nations headquarters and he gives a speech. And he says, look, the world is changing. What Italy's doing is wrong. Today it's us, but tomorrow it'll be you guys that are getting invaded. And right now you don't care because we're just some small like African place somewhere you don't care about. But when they invade where you are, you might care, right? So be careful. And as it turns out, he was quite right on that front. So Italy is kind of moving in this really egregious manner away from the League of Nations. And by 1938, they're going to join more formally with the growing sort of Axis power of Germany. So Nazi Germany is probably the one you're most familiar with in terms of the sort of instigational forces of World War II. So Hitler was elected in 1933. He was elected on a sort of nationalist platform to make Germany great again. He argued that after the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had been unfairly punished, and Germany was filled with good, strong people that were being held down by foreign powers and Jews and Slavic people, and that in order for Germany to be great again, it would have to really double down on nationalism. You see all the flags, you see, all these sorts of things, and not only take pride in itself, but much more than that, sort of come to believe that it was better than all others around it. And as part of this sort of fascist movement, you get things that you expect, like universal military conscription, right? Also, Germany had been limited, right? They weren't technically allowed to have an air force or a navy. So they did a lot of experimentation on sort of side projects, things that could be seen as something else, like rockets. And they said, well, it's not quite an air force, it's not quite a navy, right? It's something else. So during the war, actually, Germany is going to be pretty far ahead in terms of rocketry and missiles and these sorts of things. They're also conducting secret construction of planes and things like this. So as with all sort of fascist states, there's this large sense of superiority of others around them. We're going to see that again coming up. The sort of first moves of Hitler towards a wartime footing is the unification or reunification with Austria. So Hitler was actually from Austria, right? He grew up in a sort of small town outside of Vienna, but he found a sort of political footing in Germany. In 1938, Austria and Germany sort of fused together. There was this new Austrian state after World War I, and they were mostly German speaking. And it seemed sort of natural to a lot of people. It wasn't totally peaceful and smooth. It wasn't like Austria, oh, great. But there was a far-right movement growing in Austria as well. They were friendly with Hitler to an extent, and so they managed to get together. That same year, Germany is going to attack and colonize essentially a small piece of Czechoslovakia. This area, it was also part of the previous Austrian Empire, and there were a lot of German speakers there. And the pretext that Hitler laid out was, look, there's all these German people that are living under Slavic rule. This is not good. I'm just going to go in to this Czech land and just take this little section where there's all these Germans and bring them back into Greater Germany. Of course, he's going to quickly then take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, so he goes further than he says, and we'll sort of see where that ends up. So after his attacks in Czechoslovakia, there's a sort of conference between the big powers in Europe in Munich. And so here you have the leaders of France and Britain and Hitler together. And there's this idea that, look, okay, maybe Germany's gone too far, maybe they're breaking this Treaty of Versailles, maybe none of this is good. But Hitler says, look, okay, I've done what I need to do. I've gotten the Germans back together. So now we're not going to go any further. Don't worry about it. And all the other European leaders say, oh, okay, well, he's not sorry or anything, but he said he's not going to go anymore, so maybe it's good. Then, within a few months, the Nazis annex all of Czechoslovakia, right? They continue when they said they wouldn't, and they move towards the border with Poland. So people are often very critical of other European leaders from this time, saying they were sort of appeasing Hitler. They were scared of going to war. They were willing to let him kind of make some moves. There were other far-right movements around the world, and Hitler seemed to be not, much different than them at the time. So there was the sense that, you kind of give him a little, it's okay. But other people were much more critical of this. So remember, before Dr. Seuss drew kids' books, he made propaganda. So here's one. Remember, one more lollipop and then you can all go home. His shirt on the middle there says appeaser. So there's all these Nazi monsters around. He's giving them lollipops, but what's going to happen when he runs out of lollipops, man? Right? You don't want to be him. So that sort of commentary, like we're giving the Nazis all this stuff, kind of hoping they'll be cool. But everybody knows Nazis aren't cool, and so eventually it's not going to be good. Then, to everyone's surprise, Hitler and Stalin, who was the leader of Russia at the time, signed the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Act. And this really confuses people because Nazis and communists hate each other in every way imaginable. They're at the complete opposite of the political spectrum. I think oftentimes, particularly in the South, people grow up with the idea that somehow Nazis and communists are like kind of the same thing, or like Nazis and fascists and communism or something. But they're totally different. So the communist government absolutely hated the German government and vice versa. So why would they sign this pact? Well, Hitler was kind of moving east. The Soviet Union was there. They kind of had interests in between. And so the idea was these are two really big forces. They're not going to attack each other. But there was a secret addendum to this agreement that should, for whatever reason, either side have to invade Poland, they would split it down the middle, and Russia would get half of Poland, and the Nazis would get the other half. So that's exactly what's going to happen. And very quickly, in 1939, the Germans are going to invade Poland, and it's going to get split. Then you get a more sort of formalization of the Axis powers with the Tripartite Pact. You get Japan and Italy and the Nazis all agreeing to sort of mutual defense and mutual aid. But there's other weird things that happen. For example, the Soviet Union and the Japanese signed a treaty. Well, remember, the Japanese had fought Russia in 1904 and 1905, and the Russians were definitely trying to steer clear of another war out there. So all of these sort of pacts overlapping, you can really see that, at least from the European perspective, by 1940, the war is just fully on, and we'll get to the specific sort of movements of that, the military movements. But in terms just of the sort of treaty work and laying the ground for it, it's all coming even by 1939, 1940. So what about the United States? The United States has a sort of similar game plan as it does during World War I. So if you remember from World War I, the US was really slow to enter the war for lots of reasons. And this is true again in 1930. So remember, or in the 1930s. So remember, the US wasn't a League of Nations members, so they just weren't involved with all that stuff. The US was making a lot of money selling weapons to everybody around the world. We're continue to be the biggest arms dealer in the world. So in some ways, war is really good for the economy, and not taking sides allows you to sell to everybody. The US is often described as sort of isolationist. That's pretty problematic, but we can just kind of go with it. They had a small military at the time, right? Because of the Depression, there wasn't actually a large standing military. And there was a sort of commitment to neutrality. Likewise, The US was just barely starting to recover from the Depression in the late 1930s, and the idea of spending a bunch of money in Europe or somewhere else just, didn't seem good. And maybe most surprising to a lot of you was many, many Americans were pro-Hitler. A lot of Americans were anti-Semitic. A lot of Americans were deeply racist. Remember, America was legally segregated, right? It was enforced segregation in half the country, more than half the country. So a lot of Americans saw Hitler as like, a strong leader doing good stuff for his country, and like, yeah, he was racist and all, but so were other people, and Americans didn't have any idea of the sort of plans coming for later and stuff like that. So a lot of Americans were fairly pro-Hitler in the 30s. Also, though, that begins to evolve. So here you have this picture of Uncle Sam, right? His plan to lend Britain arms, with the Nazis saying he's playing with dynamite, right? And he'd be like, well, if it's dynamite, if I don't, right? By 1940, after the Nazis have invaded Poland and then they start to invade the rest of Europe, uh, America starts to talk about their role as like protecting freedom. We're going to be the great arsenal of freedom around the world, meaning we're going to sell guns to free people, but also meaning we're going to sort of protect and enforce democracy and freedom and things like this. Now, this is really problematic because a lot of our allies were not democratic, and we hadn't done this before the war. So it was sort of a opportunistic stance, for sure. In 1941, our kind of newly minted allies like Britain are running out of money, so we're going to lend them money essentially to buy weapons from us, which is a sort of a repeat of World War I as well. Then in 1940 and 41, early 41, the US is also going to start making some aggressive moves towards Japan. Japan is expanding in China, and American interests are being sort of upset there. Also, a lot of American products were sold in Southeast Asia. There were a lot of European colonies in Southeast Asia, and Japan's going to start messing with those in the 40s. The US is going to put an oil embargo on them because of that. So the US is going to start messing with Japan a little bit, even though it says it's neutral. So we'll see where that goes. So that's just some of the sort of setup, some of the background. What does it look like once the war is actually going? What are the sorts of causes of all the destruction? And how does it hit this scale that would have just seemed completely impossible, even almost by World War I standards that had seen this incredible amount of destruction? Well, one thing that really added to the chaos was the new German style of warfare that they were employing in Europe, and this allowed them to be very successful very quickly. And many of you may have heard this before, the sort of blitzkrieg style of warfare. The Germans had developed a new type of tank, the Panzer, which just means armor, that was very fast, very light, had large guns. As it gets going, they're going to get heavy armor, they're going to get much more destructive. But the Germans were utilizing a sort of new tactic. They learned that during World War I, the worst thing that happened was that trench warfare, getting bogged down somewhere. So instead, they would make lightning strikes. They had newly developed airplanes that would help them do this. Remember, airplanes in World War I were mostly for reconnaissance. They weren't that useful. But by World War II, they were getting good enough to have guns on them to be able to drop bombs. So German airplanes would fly ahead, drop bombs, shoot at targets, cause some chaos. Tanks would roll through pretty quickly. Infantry would come behind. And this really fast assault allowed the Germans to sort of overwhelm some of their enemies, to blow through enemy lines and get behind them. You never want to have your enemy come through and get behind you, because then you're kind of pinched in, you're on both sides, you have nowhere to go. So the Germans first used this tactic in Poland on like a large scale when they invaded Poland in September 1939. And that was really the start of the war from the perspective of Britain and France. Then over the next year, Germany repeats this in Denmark, Norway, Belgium, France, the Netherlands. It continues this in Poland and really just sweeps across quite quickly a lot of continental Europe, mostly Western Europe, Central Europe. In 1940, something new begins, the sort of Battle of Britain, which you may also know about. Germany was never able to cross the English Channel and actually physically attack London or attack, with tanks and infantry, but they could fly from northern France, bomb London, and fly back. And then in response, the British soldiers were able to put airplanes up in the sky and try to shoot down British planes and bombers. So that was sort of the Battle of Britain opening up. Then in 1941, in the summer, Hitler decides to do something very interesting that people hadn't really seen coming. He starts Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of the Soviet Union. So remember, the Soviet Union and Russia, or Soviet Union and Germany had this pact that they wouldn't attack each other. But Hitler realized that he'd taken over a big chunk of Europe. He wasn't going to be able just to knock out Britain right away. And he was afraid that sooner or later Britain and the Soviet Union were going to get together and crush Germany. So he thought, I can't get to Britain right now, but I can get to the Soviet Union. And maybe if I use the element of surprise, that'll be enough to really help out. At the same time, some German forces and a lot of Italian forces were expanding across North Africa and around the Mediterranean. So here you go. Here's a map showing these movements just in like the 1940s, 1940, 1941, kind of all around from Germany out into Central Europe, into Northern Europe, and then over into Russia. Really expansive. Here is a German soldier getting ready to throw a percussion grenade, right? These new types of weapons they were employing that were very effective. But it didn't just all happen over in Germany. Remember, we've already kind of shown that there was a lot of other stuff going on. So remember, we said the Japanese were extremely frustrated with that sort of League of Nations and the system that was getting set up. So, here, let me get a color for you. We talked about how they invaded this area called Manchuria, but then they started to expand into northern China. They were getting kind of frustrated though, because they had attacked China and they were hoping to take over large sections of it. China grows lots and lots of rice. This would have been a great resource for the Japanese. But China was like, it's too big. There were too many mountains, too many people, too many, rivers. It was very difficult for the Japanese to try to actually take and hold big sections. So, out of frustration, in the early 1940s, they decide that they're going to enact what's called the Southern Strategy. So, instead of trying to continue down this way and like attack China, they decided that really they should be going this way. And that if they got down here into Southeast Asia, then after getting all these resources, they could go up into China this way, and they would have sort of more power, more resources, more strategic advantages. But there was a problem. This area down here in this corner, the Southeast Asia, there were lots of colonial powers. Britain was in Burma and in Malaya. The French were in Indochina. The Dutch were in Indonesia, right? So there were already Europeans that had colonized those areas. So Japan wanted to take over those areas, and they needed some kind of way to do this. Well, what they thought was, we need to do a couple things. One, we need to keep America out of this. America at the time had colonized the Philippines, right here. So America did have interest in Southeast Asia, but America also had a really big military base over here in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. So what the Japanese thought was, what we need to do first is knock out Pearl Harbor to try and prevent Americans from just like quickly coming over and stopping us from getting south. Go south, take over Southeast Asia, kick out European colonizers, and sort of co-opt local authorities to help us. So why would local authorities help them? What was the plan here? Well, the idea, they said, was they were making a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere, which is very wordy and sounds really exciting. It sounds better in Japanese. And the idea was that Asia should be for Asians. Yeah. So there's all kinds of propaganda like this. Like, why do we have white folks running around colonizing Southeast Asia? Japan could come in, kick out those white folks, and like eventually Asia would be for the Asians. This was super hypocritical though. Japan had no desire to like free these places for their own like, spiritual benefit or for their nations or whatever. Japan wanted the resources, they wanted the manpower, they wanted the food, they wanted the oil, right? All these sorts of things. Strategic positions. So what ends up happening is Japan just replaced the colonial authorities. When Japan attacked Vietnam and Burma and Indonesia, they were able to really quickly kick out the white colonial powers. And then they sort of just took over in their place. So why was it so easy to beat up on Britain and the Dutch and the French there? Well, because all those people were involved in war in Europe. So the best British soldiers and the French or whatever, they were going to be fighting in Europe. They weren't going to be way halfway around the world in these colonies. So the Japanese had a pretty easy time taking over. They were less successful with Pearl Harbor. Although the raid kind of went as planned, and it was a surprise, they only sunk a couple of ships. They damaged quite a few. But the biggest US ships just weren't in port that day when the Japanese bombed. Also, the Japanese hoped to bomb the fuel depots that would have really slowed down Americans being able to come across in bigger ships in the future. So when they didn't blow up the fuel depots and when they didn't sink every ship, the plan only partially kept the American Navy out of the war for a brief period. But it sort of backfired on Japan in that it really pulled America into the war. Before that, a lot of Americans had been neutral. After Pearl Harbor, most Americans are like thronging to go to war, right? Their strategy in Southeast Asia is pretty successful. By 1942, the last sort of big colonial power, the British and Singapore, surrendered to Japan, and Japan really has taken over Southeast Asia pretty much wholesale from, all the way down to Australia, essentially. So you have these really expansive German and Japanese empires. They're utilizing new sort of methods, expanding. But one of the things that's going to make this all so much more deadly is in both of these theaters of war, airplanes are going to become more and more central. And just this huge number of deaths are going to come from above. Mostly it's civilians, some soldiers. But remember, in total war, as we talked about, civilians are targets. Anything's a legitimate target. If the whole nation is being mobilized to fight the war, blowing up a big chunk of the city is helping you win, right? So where airplanes had been not so useful, they'd become much more useful. There was a US military officer named Billy Mitchell, who in the interwar years had been a huge advocate of air power and had essentially developed a sort of philosophy that the future would be fought and won in the air. And the ability to bomb your enemy from very far away would essentially allow you to, knock out their production capabilities, transportation capabilities, communication lines, all these sorts of things. So this idea of air superiority was critical to the war. The Nazis utilized it in their blitzkrieg techniques, and there also became this idea of strategic bombing. If you know where the factory is that makes the machine guns, and you can bomb it at night, and the enemy can't make their machine guns anymore for a while, you're winning the war. So the idea became, how much can you bomb the other side? And at first, people cared primarily about accuracy. The planes were going pretty quick, they were pretty low, they dropped the bombs, but there were new types of bombers that could bomb from very high up. It was very difficult to shoot them down, and they could drop tons and tons of bombs, but not as efficiently. So you couldn't guarantee where those bombs were going to land. As long as you blew up the factory, that was fine. But you might also take out 3 or 4 city blocks just where people live. In the end, that was kind of seen as okay too, because that collateral damage would still sort of aid you in winning the war, right? By 1945, by the end of the war, more than 1 million civilians had died this way, from bombs just being dropped on them when they were in bed, when they were at work, when they were on the street, whatever. So the sort of level of destruction here is way beyond anything that had been seen before. There you go. There's a plane dropping those bombs. And some cities end up looking like this. So this is Dresden. This was once considered like one of the most beautiful cities in Germany or in Europe. It was where the best German art and architecture and stuff like that was. So the first firebombing was used in Japan, but pretty quickly it was also used here in Dresden. And the city was just burnt. I mean, it was just eradicated. 100,000 people were killed in one night, and the city disappears off the face of the earth. So this bombing was able to really create a different scale of destruction. At the same time, the Holocaust is starting in Europe. This is a really sort of dark chapter in human history overall. We saw that anti-Semitism was on the rise, not just in Europe, but globally in the United States as well. With the Depression, a lot of Americans and Europeans felt like somehow the Jews were secretly behind it, and there were all sort of anti-Semitic tropes that were being used and stuff like this. But for the Nazis, it was a bigger part of their propaganda than for other countries. And as they pushed into Central Europe, they colonized areas like Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, parts of what are now Russia. And those places were loaded with Jewish people and Slavic people. And in some quarters of the sort of Nazi government, the idea was to essentially destroy those people to create more living room for the German Empire, to create more space where Germans could live, but also to just eradicate them from the earth because they were part of a broader sort of racial problem for humanity. So by 1941, some members of the Nazi high command and Hitler had this idea to just completely destroy all of the Jews in Europe, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, Slavic people. Sometimes prisoners were sent to these places as well. And the Nazis began to set up camps where they would bring in trainloads of people from around Europe, North Africa, Greece, Russia, all over. And essentially you would sort them. If people looked like they could work, maybe they'd go one way. If they didn't look like they could work, they'd go the other. If you were a woman, or if you didn't look like you could work very much, or if you weren't attractive, or there were all kinds of things, you just got sent one way and you went to a gas chamber and were just immediately killed. If you looked like you might be able to work for a while, you went to a sort of labor camp where you essentially worked until you died. Some people live, but not very many. It was a sort of modern process, a mechanization of killing. So it was a factory, basically. Instead of making auto parts, you were making dead bodies. So the raw material for that was the people, was the live people, right? And the end result was dead people. And that's what it was set up to do. This process was incredibly destructive. 6 million Jews were murdered during this time within 4 or 5 years. So a really rapid destruction. There's yeah, right. So this is at the gate to Auschwitz, right? Said Work makes you free, right? This was going into the labor camp where you would be worked to death. People weren't necessarily spared for this because they were kids or anything like that. You know, they were put in there. It was a really horrible place. At the end of the war, when the Allies liberated these places, they were just stuffed with dead bodies and people that resembled dead bodies that were still just alive. And as crazy as it seems, even though we have a museum to the Holocaust and all kinds of other things here in the US, a very large percentage of Americans, a shockingly large number, either just don't think the Holocaust happened, like they think it was fake, or they get the numbers way wrong, like they think there are like a couple 100,000 people killed or something. It's very strange. Over the last 15 or 20 years, um, sort of understanding of what happened there has really dropped off, and a lot of people in the US just kind of aren't aware of it or kind of get it just way wrong. It's easily one of the most horrifying chapters of human history overall. There's a lot of information about it out there if you want to find out more about it. At the same time, the US was cooking up something also incredibly destructive. There was a sort of new weapon that was being worked on in the United States, an atomic bomb. And nobody knew what would happen when these bombs were dropped. But the idea was essentially to make a super weapon that would help America win the war. The first bomb was dropped on August 6, 1945, on Hiroshima. Then 3 days later, the US dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. In between those two bombs, 129,000 people died. It's absolutely an incredible figure. So each of these bombs, right, on average, killed 65,000 people with one bomb. The reason those cities were chosen is because they were full of people. We hadn't actually bombed them very much yet. And the idea was, as these had never been used, the US military, the US government really wanted to see what they could do. So we picked targets that were full of people so that we could measure them, so that we could see what happened. With these two bombs, more Japanese civilians were killed than all US casualties in the Pacific. So, and this was after we had already bombed, we had already just completely bombed Japan. In one night raid on Tokyo, we burned 100,000 people to death. So the level of destruction for this was absolutely incredible. At the time, people thought, well, hey, look, we're in a fight for our lives. The enemy would not show us any kind of mercy. If we have to invade Japan by land, tens of thousands of American soldiers will die. If we drop these really horrifying weapons on them, maybe they'll give up because they'll realize what we can do. And that turns out to be true. They probably would have given up after the first bomb, but the US had two different models of bomb. We wanted to try both of them as well. And we had no particular way to know whether the Japanese would have given up or not, although a lot of internal Japanese reporting shows they were on that track. Another problem was because these were brand new, there was only sort of theoretical ideas about what would happen. They didn't know about atomic sickness or any of the effects that would linger. There were some hints about it, but no real knowledge of it. And so next time we'll kind of look at some of that, some of the problems that come with these bombs. But after they're dropped, images like this start to circulate around the world. Just one bomb just completely levels cities. So really powerful, horrifying weapons, right? Here's one in color. This was after the war, so this was like several weeks or maybe a couple months later, capturing what was the destruction at Nagasaki. So you can tell it's just like all the houses, all the buildings, some stuff survived, but really not much at all. So all of this sort of death, all of this destruction really alters the sort of daily life of people around the world in strange, unexpected ways. So here's a propaganda poster. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And what they're trying to show is basically you're wasting gas, right? Hitler wants you to waste gas because then it'll be harder to win the war. Okay, so remember that. When you ride alone, you're riding with Hitler. So carpool and such. So one of the immediate responses of the war is people have to kind of decide what they're going to do. So when the Nazis invade France, okay, you're French. Are you going to run? Are you going to fight back? Are you going to collaborate with the Nazis? Are you going to become a Nazi? Um, are you going to go underground and like kind of pretend to be helping the Nazis, but really not? What are you going to do? So people have to decide whether they're going to sort of collaborate with the occupation, whether they're going to resist the occupation, whether they're going to take to the hills, all kinds of stuff. So here on the left, you see a partisan fighter. So this like young kid, this is probably from Ukraine or Poland. He's, collecting whatever guns he can, whatever ammunition he can, and he's probably living out in the woods, in the hills, like, fighting Nazis basically one-on-one whenever he can. On the right, this is in France. These are women who've decided to be pro-Nazi. So they're cooperating with the Nazi regime, right? So in France, there was a big sort of far-right Catholic movement that was relatively okay with the Nazis. They didn't like all this new liberal stuff that was happening in the 20s. Yeah, the Nazis didn't like Catholics, but that was kind of okay as long as they were kind of on the far right. The far right in French, they also didn't like, in France, they also didn't like the Jews and stuff like this. And so there was a lot of collaboration, a lot of overlap there. But at other times, you get pictures like this. It's one of my favorite pictures of the war. This lady just doesn't give a crap, right? I mean, so it's like the town's been bombed. There's like soldiers running through. This lady's like, I don't know, she went to the well to get some water. She went to this, neighbor's house to get some eggs, whatever. And she's just like walking home. It's incredible. You kind of imagine something like this. It's like the war went on in Eastern Europe for 4 years. You gotta live your life, and at a certain point, it's like this lady just stopped caring. There's soldiers running through. Who cares? She's gonna do her thing. It's really incredible, and this can only happen after the war becomes so much of like an everyday thing that you stop seeing it as horrific, right? It's like she's got runs to make, and she's gonna even get back and feed her kids or grandkids or whatever. Um, it's just wild. It's wild. So the sort of daily lives of people is very, very strange during this time, right? In particular, women have a really interesting role. They often get overlooked because people want to focus on soldiers, they want to focus on the sort of tactics and the bombs and stuff. But women were actually very, very active in World War II, much more than World War One. They play every role imaginable, from resistance fighters to collaborators to workers, intelligence officers. In Britain, 500,000 women serve in the military. So they're ambulance drivers, they're nurses, all kinds of stuff. Also, just like in World War One, they're really active in production. So lots and lots of men are kind of pulled out of the economy to go fight in the war, so women replace those jobs. Um, so here's some British female officers, right? Rosie the Riveter. Okay, right. So here you go. Here's women in the workforce. These women build tanks, they build airplanes, they just run the economies at the sort of manufacturing sector in a lot of these countries because men are off fighting. So here you go. Here's a woman working in like a machine shop. I don't know exactly what she's doing there. She looks like she's working some kind of lathe or something. I'm not sure. But so women are working these jobs they wouldn't have had before. Um, but women are also targets of brutality in a sort of special and horrible way. Um, in the Pacific theater in China and Japan, for example, there's a lot of you see comfort women, which is the sort of euphemism, which is horrible. The Japanese military recruited tens of thousands of women that were essentially put into moving brothels that accompanied Japanese soldiers around, so the Japanese soldiers could have a place to get out their like sexual frustrations, and they wouldn't have to rape civilians or be overly aggressive in the war, or they wouldn't be put out too long without being able to have sex because they were away from home or whatever. Um, Most of these women were not prostitutes or anything like that. They were just women who were abducted or who were told they were going to be doing a job as a secretary or something like this and get sort of spirited away by the Japanese. This is very controversial because the Japanese government has gone back and forth about acknowledging whether or not this happened and pretending it didn't and saying the numbers are inflated and all this sort of stuff because it's just a national humiliation for the Japanese. Also, like we saw at the end of World War One, most of these women are not going to really get their fair share after the war. Rosie the Riveter, right? As soon as the war is over, she's fired because men are coming home. They're going to want those jobs back, which creates a really strange narrative about women during the war. Simultaneously, women are going to be seen as like working and powerful, but also helpless, but also really dangerous. And this sounds crazy. How can a woman be like hardworking and necessary, but also like really helpless, but also like really dangerous for society? Um, American propaganda, well, propaganda all over the world was utilizing these tropes for different purposes. So I just grabbed a ton of sort of propaganda about women to show you these sorts of effects and how this is very confusing. So here you have this idea of like mobilizing woman power, right? Women going to work. So by 1944, a third of all civilian labor was women. That's absolutely incredible. And there's a third of a million women in military service in the US. So just tons and tons of women working. So here's a poster, do the job he left behind, right? Apply US employment services. So she's riveting, right? Are you a girl with a star-spangled heart? Join the WAC now, Women's Army Corps, right? So like join the military, help out. I found a job where I fit best. Find your war job in industry, agriculture, business, no matter what it is you do. Are you a farmer? Were you a secretary? Are you good with machines? Whatever, right? You can find a job for you. She's a WOW, woman ordnance worker, right? So she's a woman who builds bombs. So on the right, there's the different hats that are worn by all of the different female military units in the Navy, Army, nurses, and they're saying that like the I don't even remember what they called it at the time, but like the hairnet she's wearing or like the bandana she's wearing is kind of like a military hat, right? You got to have your hair up if you're working in a machine shop or whatever. Here you have women working together. Again, she's riveting these pieces of metal together. This is a really interesting photo too, because it's like black women and white women that would never meet socially, right? The US was still segregated, but they're working together to work in these machine shops. Here's a woman that's clearly, you can tell from like her white coat, she's like the engineer working on this thing, whatever it is. So women during this time are really getting this like taste of freedom, they say, even more than in World War One. They're getting this huge variety of jobs. They're asked to fill a whole new role in society. These women were married. These women have kids. These women are young. These women are old. It's just the whole spectrum, right? And so a lot more women in the workforce, this sort of changing dynamic. But yeah, become a nurse. Okay, country needs your help. But women at the same time are useful for propaganda in terms of being helpless or being victims. So even a little can help a lot now. Buy US war stamps, right? So here you have this mom and her little girl, but no dad, right? His hat's on the floor. Maybe he was killed. Maybe he's deployed. So why should you give your money to the government to fight to protect this like innocent family, right? Keep these hands off. You have Nazis, you have the Japanese. They're attacking this innocent woman, this innocent baby. So strangely, you have like really powerful women doing more work than ever before, and you're like highlighting that, you're mobilizing that. But also, these women are super vulnerable and they need you to protect them. This is why I'm buying war bonds. Okay, here's another innocent woman, this time literally with a lamb, right? So they need protection, which is weird because this is going to lead towards sort of after the war more domestication and sort of patriarchy. Like these images are very not empowering of women, right? What's this though? Booby trap, syphilis and gonorrhea. So women are hardworking. They're running the factories. We need them. They're also totally vulnerable, and we should protect them. But they're also evil and dangerous. So here, this would be a poster that would be up like in a military base, right? To remind you, don't just sleep with women because could be a trap. She might give you the clap. Loaded. Don't take chances with pickups. Loose women may also be loaded with disease. Oh, yeah, man. So, by the way, if you're wondering, these sorts of things are still up in military bases around. So, there's all these soldiers deployed in Europe. And basically, they're saying, don't get venereal disease, right? So, here again, these women seem cute and innocent and all, but they're kind of like a loaded gun. 98% of all procurable women have venereal disease. Why bet against those odds? So you have all these women, they're like dolls, they're all exactly the same. Procurable just means that you can get. So here's a poster for all the military men. It's like, hey dummies, if you can sleep with a woman, she's probably sleeping with other guys, and 98% of them have venereal disease. Of course, it's not true at all, but it's just like meant to like scare men right away from women. Women are dangerous. They're hurting the war effort. She may look clean, but pickups, good time girls, prostitutes spread syphilis and gonorrhea. You can't beat the Axis if you've got VD. Yeah, man, you're never going to be able to punch that Nazi in the face if you have, syphilis or something, right? So you got to be careful. There's an infinite number of these. These are great. You may think she's just your gal, but she may be everyone's pal. Prophylactics prevent venereal disease. Okay. You forget, but she remembers. Careless talk costs lives. Okay, so here she's like a spy. So you might be drunk at the bar looking to hook up, but really she's listening to you. You're gonna say something about the troop deployments or whatever. Wanted for murder. Her careless talk costs lives. So here is the flip of that. You have a woman who's just kind of chatty, and you know how women like to gossip, right? That's the message. So don't tell them anything that's secret because they might just be gossiping or whatever later, and someone might die because of it during the war. But strangely, um, when the war ends, you get stuff like this. Good work, sister. We never figured you could do a man-sized job. America's women have met the test. It's like, okay, congratulations. I guess you're okay to do a man's job, kind of, or whatever. But remember, all of these women after the war are going to get put right back in their place. They're going to be asked to go into homes. They're going to be asked to, give those jobs back to men. So it's a really weird role that women are going to play in the war. What else is going on? I grabbed more sort of propaganda because it kind of shows the overall nature of sort of daily life. We looked at this a little bit before with World War One. In terms of material sacrifice, everybody has to give something up. So you get things like do with less so they'll have enough, right? Drink less coffee because the soldiers need it, right? I'm in this fight too, so this lady's turning down her heat so she's not burning as much oil, so that troops in the field have more oil, right, to engage in war efforts, to put in the tanks and stuff like that. So all around the world, people are asked to sacrifice for the war. This leads to food shortages. There's all kinds of programs to limit the amount of consumer materials. In some places, you don't need those programs because there just simply isn't enough of anything. So there's things being rationed, and it leads to a sort of sense that everybody's in it together. If you can't get gas for your car and you can't get your morning coffee and you have to eat less meat and you're asked not to, eat as much bread or corn or whatever, you feel like you're part of it because you're sacrificing for the war. America's been in lots of wars recently. We're, currently still in Afghanistan and Iraq and stuff. But the average American doesn't really give up anything for that. So this is much more intense, much more of a sort of active participation. Finally, World War II has this huge racial component, which I've already kind of talked about a little bit in terms of the Holocaust. That's the sort of familiar one. But really, this is the sort of height of scientific racism and casual racism and the sort of racist, nationalist sort of ideas blending together. And you can really see it in propaganda from around the world during the war. So this is propaganda that was released by Japan in the Pacific so that American soldiers would see it, right? So it says, scenes from the home front. Is it getting as bad as all this? Yep. Negroes are the boss of the town now. So the Japanese were putting this up so that white soldiers would see it, so that white soldiers would be imagining black folks back home, like taking advantage of their women. It's, the Japanese, there weren't even very many, if any, black folks in Japan at this time. So Japanese have no particular reason to have this racial stereotype, but they do, they continue to. But that's not what they weren't even using that. They were using it to like psych out, white soldiers in the Pacific. This wasn't what was going back on in the U.S., but it's sort of like a weird tactic, right? Playing into racial fears of white soldiers. At the same time, you know, white folks in the U.S. become rabidly anti-Japanese. On the West Coast, Japanese Americans are interned, right, in camps for a few years. About 110, 112,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, were put into camps and lost their homes and lost everything. And so these sorts of pictures were really common. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood, right? So this would have been in like California or Oregon, maybe Washington, when Japanese folks were getting removed from their houses and sort of shuffled off the West Coast. Here's another piece of Japanese propaganda depicting Britain and the United States as devils who drink milk and sort of step on bones and stuff. Asians don't really drink a lot of milk, right? So they find that kind of weird. So yeah, this is weird, right? Like, why is this? Well, it's sort of a way of demonizing, literally, your enemies. America does this too, right? So here's some propaganda posters from the West Coast. This is the enemy. Did Japanese people really have long nails and, I don't know, vampire-looking faces and like weird elf ears with super yellow skin? No, right? It's like playing into racist tropes that Americans already had about the Japanese, and using that to like hype up the fear, hype up the violence, to convince people to go to war, essentially. So this was another poster that was hung up in factories around the US. Tokyo Kid was like a prominent propaganda piece. Much waste of material makes so happy, thank you. Right, again, the Japanese are depicted as like subhuman. They have really weird, exaggerated features. Their English is depicted as bad, right? And these are just like super weird racial tropes. That really, dark skin. Most Japanese people do not look like that at all. And so the idea being you're kind of rallying up the population to hate these people based on a sort of racial ideology. But it wasn't just the US and Japan where this occurred. This occurs all over. So here's Russian propaganda, or propaganda, Polish propaganda about the Russians. So it's showing the Russians as like monstrous rapists, um, right? Or here's Russian propaganda against Jewish folks that are basically saying like, yeah, even though the war is on, like the Russian army isn't as important to Jews as like money is, right? So there's all kinds of this sort of stuff going on. It's not just the Holocaust. It's not just Americans really racializing Japanese. It's part of a much broader sort of global way of thinking about race. And as we're going to see, like in a couple times, not immediately after the war, but like a couple lectures down the road, when we talk about decolonization, this is all going to change pretty radically. That's not to say that racism isn't still around. There's not still like global obsession with whiteness or whatever. There is. But this idea that you can just have like massive public displays of racism for the purpose of like motivating your nation or something, more or less has gone away in this sort of acceptable format. So we'll get back to some of that stuff though when we talk decolonization. So World War II is going to end with the total surrender of Axis powers to the Allies, but it's going to start to fray the second it happens. So the British, the French, the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, we're all kind of in it together. And then they're going to start going their own ways as imperialism starts to fall apart. So next time we'll talk about sort of the ending of the war, the sort of quest for justice coming out of the war, and this immediately after the war new kind of post-war world that leads straight into the Cold War and sets up the next sort of 20 or 30 years politically. So let me know what questions you have. Get on that reading. Otherwise, see you next time.